Out of the 380 flamethrower operatives deployed to Iwo Jima, only 18 survived the island. Their average life expectancy was only 4 minutes on the battlefield, yet they were simultaneously considered both the most valuable and the most feared weapon in the US Marines arsenal. The story of these men, however, is far darker and more harrowing than most accounts convey, and to truly grasp their experience, one must first understand the nature of Iwo Jima itself, the environment, the enemy, and the weapon that they carried. See, when people discuss the Pacific War, they often highlight battles like Guadalcanal or Okinawa, but Iwo Jima was completely different. The island itself is only about 8 square miles, a jagged volcanic outcrop lying between the Marianas and the Japanese mainland. Its size, though, does belie its strategical significance, especially by early 1945, as Iwo Jima had become one of the most valuable pieces of ground in the Pacific Theater. For the Americans, it was essential for several reasons, most importantly being that B-29 bombers flying from the Marianas to Japan had to pass over Iwo Jima, and Japanese radar installations and fighters on the island could track and intercept these bombers, threatening the entire air campaign against the Japanese mainland. Capturing the island would provide a forward base for fighter escorts, emergency landings, and shorter bombing runs with heavier payloads. The Japanese defenders were well aware of the island's importance and anticipated an American assault, but unlike previous islands, they did not plan to confront the attackers in the traditional sense, meeting them at the beach with prepared fortifications. Experience had taught them that surface defenses alone were no match for the combined firepower of American naval artillery and airstrikes. Instead, they approached the problem differently. They went underground. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was appointed commander of the island's defenses, and he was an experienced officer who had survived numerous campaigns. Kuribayashi understood the reality. He would not win. Survival was unlikely, but his goal was not victory, it was attrition. He aimed to bleed the Americans for every inch of ground, to buy Japan as much time as possible before the inevitable invasion of the home islands. American intelligence initially estimated roughly 13,000 Japanese defenders, but in reality, it was nearly 23,000. They were all waiting on Iwo Jima, and nearly all were entrenched in an extensive network of fortifications. Over 11 miles of tunnels had been carved through the island's soft volcanic rock, a task made feasible by its relative ease of excavation. Within these tunnels were bunkers, pillboxes, machine gun nests, artillery positions, storage facilities, and supply depots, all interconnected. Kuribayashi had pre-calculated artillery trajectories, firing lanes, and overlapping zones of fire. There were no conventional front lines. The island's defenses was continuous, self-supporting web of lethal positions capable of shifting as needed. So when Americans launched the invasion on February 19th, 1945, they relied on familiar tactics. Days of naval and aerial bombardment were intended to soften defenses and level fortifications. Battleships and cruisers unleashed everything from high explosive shells to incendiary rounds. From the ocean, the island appeared devastated, a blackened wasteland, yet beneath the superficial destruction, almost nothing critical was neutralized. The first wave of Marines hit the beaches and discovered the challenge immediately. The volcanic ash that carpeted the island acted like a deep, loose sand. Boots sank with every step, vehicles stalled, and digging trenches or finding cover became nearly impossible. For nearly an hour, the Marines faced no apparent resistance. It was eerily quiet, calm before the storm, really. Then Kuribayashi gave the order. Machine guns, mortars, and pre-sighted artillery erupted simultaneously. Marines packed together on the beach with no cover. They were cut down in clusters, yet somehow they pushed inland, inch by inch, paying a relentless toll in their lives. As they advanced, the Marines confronted the reality of Iwo Jima's defensive labyrinth. Bunkers and pillboxes were formidable. Grenades and satchel charges were often the only means of clearing them, but even then, the Japanese had anticipated such attacks. Many pillboxes were zigzagged or compartmentalized. A single blast would rarely neutralize all occupants. Japanese soldiers used tunnels to maneuver beneath advancing Marines, emerging from unexpected angles to fire on positions that had already been secured as far as the Americans knew. Casualties mounted rapidly, and the battlefield devolved into a chaotic, brutal close-quarters fighting situation. This is where the flamethrower came into play. The M2 flamethrower was the standard weapon for clearing bunkers. It consisted of 2 large tanks filled with thickened gasoline, a smaller compressed nitrogen tank to propel the fuel, and a metal tube with an igniter at the tip. A single operator had a mere 7 seconds of continuous fire, roughly 20 yards of range. To be effective though, operators had to move perpetually closer to the target, unleashing their fuel in precise bursts and retreat before exhausting their supply. Every flamethrower operator was immediately identifiable on the battlefield by the massive tanks on their back. To the Japanese defenders, they were the single most dangerous threat, drawing concentrated fire. Their own squad would provide supportive fire, attempting to cover the approach, but with 70 pounds of equipment and fortified enemy positions, survival was far from guaranteed. Captured operators faced horrors beyond death. Because of the psychological and lethal effect of the weapon, Japanese troops often executed them immediately or subjected them to prolonged, cruel punishment. One operator misfiring at a cave entrance was dragged inside and could be heard for 2 full days by his comrades, who were powerless to intervene. The flamethrower's consequences were brutal and immediate. In confined spaces, a well-aimed burst could ignite the fuel inside, raising temperatures to over 2,000 degrees and consuming the oxygen within. Marines developed tactics such as the wet burst, first saturating a target with fuel, then igniting it to ensure the complete destruction of defenders. These actions produced horrifying results, and even trained soldiers were psychologically affected by the sights, sounds, and smells that their own weapon had produced. Despite these dangers, flamethrowers remained essential. Casualties among operators were extreme, but without them, the advance through fortified positions would have been impossible. To increase survivability and firepower, flame tanks were introduced. Modified M4 Sherman tanks dubbed POA CWS H1S replaced the main guns with a flamethrower capable of firing hundreds of gallons of fuel up to 100 yards. They worked in tandem with infantry and regular tanks, clearing pillboxes with a level of effectiveness impossible for handheld flamethrowers alone. Yet these tanks carried enormous risk. Every vehicle was a moving target with hundreds of gallons of flammable fuel inside. Once engaged, enemy fire focused on them relentlessly. The combined use of handheld flamethrowers and flamethrower tanks, however, was decisive. It allowed the Marines to systematically clear bunkers and pillboxes, inching forward through a deadly maze of tunnels and fortifications. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was immense, as they could no longer safely emerge from their hiding places, and by March the majority of the island had fallen, but at a staggering human cost. The toll on the flamethrower operators remained the highest of any unit. Only 18 of the original 380 survived, a sobering testament to the weapon's danger. Their actions, however, were pivotal. Every bunker cleared by flame meant fewer Marines killed by gunfire and grenades, allowing the island to be secured and ultimately enabled air operations over Japan from Iwo Jima. The story of Iwo Jima's flamethrower operators is a stark illustration of extreme conditions in Pacific warfare. The weapon's use required immense courage, as every step forward was a calculated risk against both death and capture. Operators carried not just the physical burden of their equipment, but the psychological weight of the devastation it brought. They confronted an enemy prepared to exploit every weakness in an environment designed to neutralize conventional tactics. Their bravery and their tactical necessity of their role underscores a brutal truth about the island campaign. Victory was only possible through a combination of sheer courage, coordination, and industrially produced firepower, applied for precision under conditions of unimaginable risk. The legacy of these operators extends beyond their immediate combat effect. They exemplified the extreme human cost of overcoming a well-prepared fortified enemy in the Pacific. Their experiences revealed stark realities of close quarters combat against an adversary who had embraced defensive ingenuity. The psychological strain of wielding such a terrifying weapon, and on Iwo Jima the flamethrower was simultaneously the deadliest tool and the most feared, and the single factor that enabled the Marines to advance through traditional firepower alone would have failed. The courage of these men and the ferocity of the battle are preserved in photographs, films, and the memories of the survivors, but the full scope of the ordeal, 4 minutes of exposure at a time, inching forward, death under the weight of a burning inferno, is almost beyond comprehension. Yet it is in these details that the story of Iwo Jima's flamethrower operators stands as a lasting testament to the extreme measures demanded by modern warfare and the human cost required to achieve strategic operations in the Pacific Theater. So if you found this video gripping and want to hear more accounts of bravery, strategy, or the realities of war, subscribe and hit the notification bell. There's a lot more history waiting to be uncovered.